Users now spend most of their time on the internet as they do their jobs, but the web is full of threats like ransomware, and failure to secure it can be disastrous. IT needs to enable web usage, but how can they ensure that users stay safe? Zscaler Cloud Browser Isolation stops web-based threats in their tracks. It isolates threatening or suspicious web sessions in the Zero Trust Exchange and streams to the end user device only real-time pixels of said sessions, not active content. This keeps threats from reaching endpoints while enabling productivity. Let's look at a demo.
Let's take a look at how we can create isolation policies on Zscaler to isolate potentially malicious destinations. Now, you can create an URL filtering policy. We have always provided the capability to allow traffic, caution traffic, or block traffic. With cloud browser isolation, you get a fourth action, which is isolate. You'd be able to select all the necessary criteria of your choice. In my case, I've selected a handful of URL categories, which includes miscellaneous and unknown, social networking, webmail, which are very common use case for isolation. But additionally, I have a custom category as well as news categories, which I'm isolating. What I've selected here is isolate as an action and an isolation profile. Let's take a look at what an isolation profile is. Isolation profile is an object which we create on the administrative UI of the cloud browser isolation. It is basically where you define what regions and user is allowed to get an isolation container in. Whatever is closest to the user is where he gets an isolation container. We can also define how the cookies are handled for the user, what kind of certificates need to be deployed within the isolation browser when a user accesses it, and also certain security policies which define if the user is able to share clipboard with the isolation environment, basically copy paste, would the user be able to upload or download a file to the isolated environment or to the isolated web page or not. Additionally, will the user be able to view files within the isolation environment? Now, once the profile is created and is referenced in a ZIA policy, we are good to go. Let's try and access CNN.com. And as per my policy, the same needs to be isolated and does get isolated. Now, what I'm seeing is a stream of pixels from my isolated browser, which is rendering CNN within it. Now, I would still be able to go ahead, click on content. I would be able to go ahead and pass keystrokes. And I would be able to interact with this web page very similar to how I would interact with the same web page if it were loaded onto my local computer. Now, if I were to go ahead and access, let's say, an fileexamples.com web page, and let's see what happens. I can load that web page within the isolated environment, a new tab on my native browser, a new tab within the isolation environment, and the same is loaded. If I were to try and access a file which I might have downloaded from here, yes, I would still be able to view that file within the isolated environment. My policy dictates that I can download the file onto my local computer based on the profile I've selected, but I will choose to download the file onto my protected storage. Now, once the file is on the protected storage, I should be able to go to the protected storage, look at that particular file, and basically be able to view that within the isolated environment. So even if this file were potentially malicious or, let's say, weaponized, it would have absolutely no effect on my computer. It will be confined to the isolation environment. All the traffic which is being processed or which is being generated from the cloud browser is accounted for, is logged. You could go ahead and set a filter on a location and say, if the location is cloud browser, show me all the logs which have been generated, and you should be able to see all the transactions which happened from my isolated browser onto the internet. So every single transaction which is happening from the isolated environment is accounted for and is enforced with the policies which are defined on Zscaler CI.